Good afternoon, everyone. I am Carlos Ivan Lopez, Vice President of the Venezuelan American Association of the U.S. I would like to welcome you today to our conversation with Vanessa Neumann. I would like to give heartfelt thanks to Dr. Neumann for taking her time to be with us today, and to our Vice President, Ambassador Michael Scott, who will guide us through the discussion as a moderator. The Venezuelan American Association has been promoting exchange between Venezuela and the U.S. for 85 years. During this unprecedented crisis, VAUS has done its utmost to provide information to foster discussion and spark action. We thank you all for being with us today and on our quest for knowledge and for a better future for Venezuela. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Vanessa Neumann is an author, entrepreneur, diplomat, and security expert. She's the president and founder of the anti-corruption and anti-trafficking consultancy Asymmetrical. Dr. Neumann wrote Blood Profits: How American Consumers Unwittingly Fund Terrorists. From March 2019 through November 2020, she served as the Venezuelan interim government official representative to the United Kingdom and Ireland. In 2008 and 2009, Dr. Neumann observed and evaluated the reintegration of Colombian paramilitaries at the invitation of the office of President Álvaro Uribe. Subsequently, she worked as a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense on asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency. Dr. Neumann served for 4 years on the task force to combat illicit trade of the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. In May 2018, for the Counter-Extremist Project, she co-authored The Many Criminal Heads of the Golden Hydra, an extensive analysis of illicit trade, corruption, and terrorist financing in South America tri-border area. Finally, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Michael Scott. Mr. Scott was a U.S. ambassador to Venezuela from 1990 to 1993. Besides Caracas, his other foreign service postings were Buenos Aires, Saigon, Santo Domingo, Naples, Rome, San Jose, Bogota, and Washington, D.C. Since his retirement from the State Department, Ambassador Scott has pursued a second career in anti-corruption, money laundering, and risk management services. He's principal of the binational US and Colombia consortium, SCOL and CERNA. Now, I turn the program to him to begin the conversation. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Carlos. First, let me let everyone know that this conversation is on the record. If you want to ask a question, just click the little Q&A button on your lower right, I believe. Write your question at any time, and then in the last third of the program, I will read as many questions as I can, and Vanessa Neumann will answer them. Well, it's a pleasure to talk with Vanessa Neumann today. We could actually do several webinars with her on her time as Juan Guaido's ambassador to the UK, on her company's work against drug trafficking and terrorism, on her experiences in such places as Lebanon, Syria, Algeria, China, Mongolia, Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, on her insights into cigarette smuggling, sports corruption, pharmaceutical counterfeiting, role of travel agencies. Unfortunately, we only have one webinar today, so we will try to fit it all in. Let me start with the book. This is the book here. Blood Profits.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. How American Consumers Unwittingly Fund Terrorists. When I read the book, I saw two very broad themes. One is the connection, the nexus of terrorism and criminality. And the other one, what the title comes from, is the role of ordinary consumers, at least ordinary consumers who buy Gucci bags, in support of both terrorism and criminality. Now, I personally have been involved in the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing for some years now, involving governments, international institutions, drug traffickers, guerrilla groups, banks, corporations. But as far as I know, Vanessa, your book is the first to feature the role of consumers. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you for having me, and thank you. Of course, I have a rather funny photograph of me of you and me at my book launch in the in a club in New York at the Lotus Club for the book, and you're signing. I'm signing it to you, and you're watching me sign. So so thank you. You've been sort of an integral part of promoting this book from the get-go. Well, what I wanted to highlight was also was to show how criminality and terrorism and corruption really touches everybody's lives, and the fact that all of this starts and how it eats away at the state, it eats away at the human rights structure, at the institutionality of governments, and it impacts people's lives. This is, of course, my obsession, because being a Venezuelan, and a Venezuelan who had the privilege of being educated in the United States and working in several countries, and contrasting what happened from when I was a child, when Venezuela was one of the richest countries on earth, where the Concorde flew, to Paris, to then watching people, and it's in my book, whose internet shuts down, the water shuts down, and it ends in the beginning of 2017. And of course, from the loss of internet and water, as my friend, as I'm talking to him, in the beginning of 2017, to the absolute horrific humanitarian crisis now, it's even more shocking. But all of this happens because governments became corrupt, and through that corruption, they became beholden to their own personal interests, not the interests of the citizens they represent, and also to the interests, and became slaves and service providers, really, to international criminal organizations, like the drug cartels of Colombia, like the Mexican drug cartels, and then also terrorist groups, whether it's the FARC or the ELN. And I said this in 2017, and now we see the impact on civilians in Apure, fleeing because of the fighting between the Venezuelan military and the FARC ELN. And this all starts with corruption and what people buy. So what I wanted to explain to people is that these concepts are not way out there. They're not, it's not theory. It touches people's lives in two ways. It touches people's lives in the lives the homes, the water doesn't get delivered, the medicines don't arrive, or the homes get destroyed in a landslide because the money wasn't there because of the corruption. And it also touches everybody's lives in the things that you buy that feed these terrorist and criminal organizations that then turn around and engage with these corrupt governments. You are providing the money. This is a money business. All of this starts with financial interests, the financial interests of the corrupt politicians and the financial interests of the transnational criminal organizations and terrorist organizations. And to reach that money, they need to reach the consumers. They need to reach the average Joe, the you and me, who goes and buys stuff. Uribe was very strong on this. So was Santos when he was defense minister, speaking at the UN, that the narcotics use in the United States feeds a lot of the FARC and the ELN. I wanted to highlight also how a lot of the trafficking in pharmaceuticals in Africa feeds a lot of this issue, it feeds a lot of the corruption and why people die because they don't get the medicines. And the fact that even the counterfeiting industry, even of handbags and things like that, trivial as it may seem, on Canal Street, is also feeding, Chinese triads that are smuggling women and enslaving women, etc. So that these issues, the corruption and the transnational criminals and the terrorists, touch the lives of everyone, from the rich countries that fund them to the citizens in the countries that become poorer and poorer because they suffer the effects.
Right. The other theme that you emphasize in the book that I think touches even more on the Venezuelan crisis today is the interconnection of terrorism, criminality, and corruption. You call it at one point the crime terror pipeline. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the crime terror pipeline, or CTP, is not actually unique to me. It's a concept that actually evolved after I think it was around 2012, 2013, certainly by 2012, when I returned from Lebanon, that I got very involved with working with the asymmetric warfare group and working on concepts of asymmetric warfare, how it works and how to train and prevent against it or utilize its tools in Central America. I think it was the following year I got invited by the US State Department and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the FCO, to participate in joint US and UK counterterrorism meetings that were held both in the US, in Washington, DC, with US and UK support, and then again in London. So I was flown to London as one of these sort of expert ponentes, as we say in Spanish, presenters, at a time when Theresa May was the Home Secretary. This is before she was before she became Prime Minister. And in these meetings between the US and the US State Department and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the concept of crime and terror pipelines was something that had gained a lot of currency and became very important, because they realized that a lot of the dirty money that funds these organizations in these other countries flows through the rich countries like the US and the UK. So they needed to understand how this comes back to haunt them, not just in dirty financial systems, but in things like, for instance, foreign terrorist fighters that get recruited, and how what is happening in the US and the UK connects to frontline fights that they are having in other countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia, troubles in Venezuela, Somalia. And so it was around 2012, 2013, when that term gained a lot of currency, both in the US state and defense departments, and also in the UK government. And so there was a bunch of us at the time working on that. And mapping out a critical component of that is mapping out the networks, mapping out the critical nodes, who are the fixers and the facilitators, who are the lawyers, who are the bankers, how do you destabilize those networks so that you have a chance to dismantle them and bring them down, and have a peaceful, have a what we call left of boom, which is, before the bomb goes off, what we call left of boom intervention to find a solution that brings peace before you have to send soldiers or young boys to get killed in war zones. The easy way is try and identify the money and stop the money.
But time and again in your book, you find in a specific area, a specific country, where a government or a group is instigating terrorism. There's also criminality, ordinary criminality, and there is corruption at the same time. It's one bad bag of things, which brings me automatically to Venezuela, which some people would describe, I would describe as arguably the best example of terrorism, criminality, and corruption of all kinds, all packed into one. You were, for a while, the ambassador of Juan Guaido to the UK. You had a lot to do with keeping the gold in the Bank of England away from Maduro. Tell us about that for a little while.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, no, that I have to say, I have a couple of, I have still a very strong relationship with the UK. I always did, as I mentioned, that it dates back to, well, it dates back before that. Yeah, I grew up with a lot of Brits. I know Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, since when he was an MP, since before he was mayor. My sort of godmother figure was his boss when he was a columnist at the Telegraph and lived in Henley. So my ties to the UK stretch back a long way. And I still have the privilege and the honor to be able to work with them on a few issues on a case-by-case basis. They have, when I arrived in London, there was or before I arrived in London, Maduro was trying to pull the gold, which are the national reserves, out of London. And it's rather unusual because, by the way, if you deal with gold, which the irony is I have actually dealt with gold trading in my private sector capacity for Asymmetrica, so I actually know how this works. And actually even in Dubai, so I've seen it, up close and personal. They said, well, he said, give us our gold reserves. We're your client. The Bank of England has a client relationship with these countries, and you need to put it on a plane and send it to wherever we say. First of all, it's highly unusual to transfer money, especially gold reserves, on an airplane. Usually in any normal country, you take the tag off and you do a transfer by saying from Bank of England to Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The gold stays in the same little cage and you change the ticket. Maduro wanted it put on a plane. Put on a plane to where we don't know, but we can suspect that it was either Russia or Iran or Turkey, which is where a lot of the gold has gone. And all of that gold has gone either siphoned off or to pay for favor, to him and his cronies, or paid for, the favors of his foreign supporters, whether it's Iran and its gasoline, or Cuba and its intelligence services, or China, or to pay off its debts. But at any rate, what Maduro's plan was for this was to use that gold to enrich themselves, keep himself in power, and continue the slaughter of the Venezuelan people. And ever since I went back to Caracas in May 2017, I was already, went to see firsthand, enjoying the protests. I don't know if you remember, and they were shooting young students at point blank range and then running them over with APVs. All of that money. And I also led the protest at that time, against Goldman Sachs for the blood bonds, the hunger bonds that they had given $300 million. And it became clear in 2017 that giving Maduro access to the international financial system, whether it was the hunger bonds of Goldman Sachs or the gold in the Bank of England, was going not to help the Venezuelan people, but to enrich them and actually to pay for their continued torture, crimes against humanity, and slaughter. So we managed to say, hey, actually, you recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate constitutional president. That means that you can't hand over Maduro, which means that the Bank of England relationship is not with Maduro, that it needs to be with Juan Guaido. And if it's not, and if for some reason there's some glitch, and we're going now to the Supreme Court in July, if the Supreme Court needs to decide whether it does actually speaks for Juan Guaido, the worst case scenario, I don't see a scenario where they give it to Maduro. The worst case scenario is it stays there until Venezuela has free and fair elections. So it is a key component. And if you want to access those $2.2 billion of gold bullion sitting here in the city of London, go win a free and fair election. And so it becomes part of that shift. So that's a great honor, and it was an honor and a pleasure to work with the UK on that. It took a lot of pressure. It took a strategy that entailed private meetings with the FCO, as well as oodles of interviews with the Financial Times, with the Prime Minister, with the Foreign Minister, and it was great. It was really sort of a team effort, and we're forever grateful to the UK for standing up for human rights and for legitimacy. And the importance about that case is that it gives an imprimatur, it gives a template to disband and defund dictatorships everywhere. So if you want to just cling to power, and once you get into power, one of the asymmetries is you get to power and then you have all the rights of a state. You can move the planes, you control the ports, you control the central bank, you control your foreign reserves. And if you just cling to power and just murder the people who want you out, you can still move all that. So this case that is before the Supreme Court in July 19th, I believe is the date, actually could set the template for anti-dictatorships everywhere. That if you just cling to power without democracy, without legitimacy, and with human rights abuses, you may lose access to the toys and the privileges of national sovereignty.
Well, good job. But in November, you resigned from the position of ambassador to the UK and Ireland. Why?
Is a number of reasons, personal and professional. On a personal level, I had spent 2 years basically funding my own job in the UK without a salary. In the end, they did give us something, but it literally arrived after I resigned, and I got docked part of my pay for having resigned. You know, my home was in New York, and I was paying rent in London, and I didn't really have so why the case is going to the Supreme Court is also that although I worked very, very strongly and closely with the UK government, they never PNG'd, they never gave a persona non grata to Maduro ambassador. So she remained in post in London, and the Brits did that so that they could keep their mission in Caracas fully intact, right? So that reciprocity would not apply. However, that made my situation quite complicated. I couldn't go back to running my private business because my business was anti-corruption, and I was now a politically exposed person. So I couldn't earn a living. I wasn't earning a living. I didn't have a home. I didn't have with Brexit, I was going to lose my visa, which because I was here on a European passport, and I thought it became untenable. And I wanted to go back, make a living, and I'm in the process of adopting children. So my desire to adopt and earn and have a more normal, regular life was important. However, the other component was I just saw that we were heading into year 3 of the Guaido administration, of the Guaido, you know, interim presidency. I saw a significant lack of strategy in the Guaido camp. I saw that even the strategy of our, you know, their greatest allies, the United States, was a bit confused and unclear. And I think it was a little bit naive in thinking that in naming Guaido, things would go, you know, they would automatically support him, and, you know, Maduro would run. Actually,
some of us were sure that it wasn't going to be so easy.
Right. And it wasn't so easy. It wasn't so easy. And they were sitting on the narco-terrorist indictments. I did not work on them, but I have a lot of friends who did work on those indictments, in those investigations for many years, and knew that it was there. They should have come out immediately. We recognized Guaido, he's a narco-terrorist. Here are the indictments. Here's the evidence. And then that would have really made it much easier in working with the international community to say, in backing Maduro, you're not backing a government, you're backing a drug cartel. And that should have happened much faster. And I think that, you know, the infighting of the G4 parties was always is a permanent condition and is unfortunate.
Explain G4 for people.
So G4 is basically the main 4 political parties, right? Voluntad Popular, Primero Justicia, Acción Democrática. Wait, which one has escaped my memory at the moment? And Acción Democrática, Primero Justicia, Voluntad Popular. And those are the parties that form the coalition, basically, to back Guaido. Normally, the presidency to which Guaido has a claim is that his authority is based on the fact that when the presidency is deemed vacant, because the election didn't happen or wasn't legitimate, and the 2018 election was deemed illegitimate by the entire democratic world, basically, then the presidency is deemed vacant, and then it's assumed on an interim basis by the president of the National Assembly that was democratically elected. So Guaido was that role. He was the president of the National Assembly that was democratically elected in 2015. Their term ran out in 2020. With that running out, and the term is supposed to rotate, the argument for the legitimacy of his tenure and his mandate became more and more complicated. Maduro is a thug and a brutal dictator by any standard. Let that be absolutely clear. There is no way Maduro is legitimate. However, the mandate of Guaido became constitutionally complicated, which meant also that a lot of the political parties saw opportunity. That meant a fracture. That meant that we didn't have a very strong and effective strategy. I didn't see the strategy in pursuing and going after the strategic nodes and the networks that support him. I saw backpedaling in the international community, which breaks my heart, because Venezuelans continue to suffer, be tortured, and go hungry. And I just thought that the time had come, with the backsliding in the international community, for me to just get back to having a life, and that actually I would always continue to fight for Venezuela. I always have, and I always will, but I could do it perhaps more effectively as an independent voice than within the Guaido interim administration.
So you sound pessimistic about the future of Venezuela. I and many others have been pessimistic for years now, including at the very beginning of the Guaido period. There's just too many generals, 3,000 more than NATO has, all of them millionaires, except for maybe 1,000 who are billionaires. There's too many Cubans, too many militias. Venezuela is the perfect illustration of how powerful a collection of terrorism, criminality, and corruption can be. Are you as pessimistic as all of that this is just going to go on forever, like Cuba, like North Korea?
I think it's very complicated. I think change will come eventually, but it is, as you say, Cuba and North Korea prove the resilience of countries to resist sanctions. Sanctions are one thing. What has happened here is that Maduro is surviving on a perfect, not a perfect, it's imperfect, but it's a clever and effective network of illicit finance, of illicit trade, whether it's the gold or the oil. And so being a criminal becomes more and more profitable the more desperate a country becomes, right? So if you're the clever one who knows how to design shell companies like Alex Saab was, but there are others, he's the most famous example, and we call them super connectors or hyper facilitators, because they connect different networks, not just the cartels and not just the Chavistas, but the cartels and the Chavistas to Iran and then to Russia. So when you bring these different networks together and put them together like he does, that's exactly what's keeping Maduro afloat. And the price goes up, right? I mean, if you're dealing with someone as dirty as Venezuela and you're the fixer, you charge a whole lot of money for that. So there's a lot of dirty money to be made. And so it's very profitable for a lot of people. So that he's perfected that. And while in tackling that is very, very, very hard. There's always a different way. There's always a different shell company. There's always someone else. I think that there have been some signs of hope this week with, you're trying to get, the CNE, the Electoral Commission said, oh, they'll accept two foreigners. I know two opposition leaders. I know the accusation is that these are opposition, that these are not real opposition, that they're just trying to make a deal with Biden. But as you know from diplomacy, as you know as an ambassador, Michael, you start with a little bit of the things, build on the successes, and see if it gets you somewhere. We are a very, very long way from change. But the challenges are this. He's supported basically from criminals and illicit finance, plus the countries of Cuba, Iran, Russia, to a lesser extent, Turkey, because of the gold transactions, etc., and Dubai also because of the gold transactions. Cuba has the strongest interest in keeping it going. You could negotiate with Cuba. So let's do it the other way around. Let's start with China. China is the one who really wants to, is most prepared perhaps to get rid of the Maduro nightmare. They haven't been lending the money. They're still owed money. But really, to what extent, since they don't really have a lot of control over Maduro, they don't have a lot of palanca, they don't have a lot of leverage over Maduro, they might want to have change. They might want to see a new regime where they get their money back, with a flourishing or developing country. If the country changes regime and starts to grow, China would be happy, right? They would want to be a partner, and you can say, hey, be our partner in a new and developing Venezuela. Okay. But do they have the leverage to get rid of Maduro? No. They might want change, but they can't say, time for you to go. Russia, on the other hand, Iran is keeping him in, and that's working really nicely for them because it's helping them evade sanctions. They're taking the gasoline, they're taking the oil, they're getting paid in gold and other things. So Iran is not going to be a player in a new Venezuela. So they are fully motivated to keep supporting Maduro. They are out if Maduro goes. So they're motivated to keep up.
And so is Cuba.
And so is Cuba, right? Russia got its money, got paid back. So they don't really, they're happy. they're setting up, espionage networks, and they're taking gas concessions. They're not in a hurry. They're in it for the long term. Sticking it to the US is very fun for them, and it's low cost. Supporting Maduro is low cost, and they got their money out. Cuba has a great incentive to stay there. Now, you could negotiate with Cuba. Cuba are the ones who are running the espionage rings, suppressing dissent, and really keeping Maduro in power very strongly. They're probably the number one. Now, here's the problem. You could get Cuba out, but here's the negotiation, which makes you lose the vote of Florida. Then you would have to say to Cuba, hey, Cuba, trade with the US instead, as long as you get out of Venezuela. I need to see that all your espionage people get out, that you stop the torture and the dissent, and we are going to pay you as the United States of America or the United Kingdom to get out of Venezuela.
Now, come now, Cuba.
There's that negotiation to be had, but politically,
Cuba is as much a terrorism, criminality, corruption bundle, if not more. It's the original model in the Western Hemisphere than Venezuela. I can't imagine any circumstance in which Cuba would want to negotiate with the United States for almost anything in order to change things in Venezuela. Cuba is practically a lost cause, and it's been that way for almost as long as I've been alive. Not quite, but it's just very difficult for me to imagine what Cuba would gain realistically from the U.S. Cuba wants to maintain what it has, which is the model of what Venezuela has, which is similar to what North Korea and China have. And negotiations, changing their system, which is the only thing which could entice the United States, not just Florida, but the United States and its long-term policy to change a policy with Cuba. They're just not going to change their system. So I see that as just one more dead end. I know it's a debatable point, but I wanted you to hear that.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you, Michael, with all due respect. I think that I know for a fact, I do know Cuba fairly well. And I have a little bit of firsthand experience on the topic. And I do think with the country, and I think they have been saying for some time they wanted to open it up. However, yes, they're Cubans, they lie. So, but however, they do want, what they need to do is to open up the economy and enrich themselves and improve the economy a bit, but not throw it wide open, because if they throw it wide open, the ruling class is gone. But the ruling class
thought that was
we
thought that was going to happen under Obama, but it didn't happen. The reverse happened.
Nope, that's right. It didn't. Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
let's turn to the new administration in Washington. 100 days now. Everyone is talking about a bipartisan policy toward Venezuela. The image of Juan Guaido receiving a standing ovation in January of 2019 is what lingers on, and I think that probably is the intention of people in the administration. Do you accept that there will be little or no change under President Biden in terms of Venezuela?
Well, I don't know what you mean by little or no change. In other words, I do think that, they're not going to back Maduro, right? So that's not on the table. They're not going to shift allegiances. I think they're going to continue to nominally back Juan Guaido, because that's who you've got. It's Maduro or Guaido. Everybody is clear that Guaido is I like him personally. I like him very much. I had the privilege of spending time with him. I'm the one who took him to number 10 for the meeting with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And he's a brave, funny, charming man. But 3 years on is less interim. So that's complicated for anybody, including the United States. The Biden administration wants to seek change. They're looking for more multilateral solutions. They're pressuring for negotiations for small democratic changes, like you saw the acceptance of 2 opposition people in the Electoral Commission. And that's not enough. It's not nearly enough. They need to, free the political prisoners. And there's a very clear shopping list that the US keeps saying, you do these things in this order, which was published last year, and we will consider perhaps, and you get to free and fair elections, and you continue to do things. And for every good thing that you do on this list at these stages, we will drop sanctions and we will reward you. They're at 0.1 at this. But they're also working with the international community. There's also an initiative that's going at the OECD. There's greater awareness of the blood gold. So that has become an issue in the international community. And there's a growing push to strangle the illicit trade and to continue to push for small democratic changes. However, between you and me, it's very small. I was told yesterday, including by the British delegation, that we might hope that, I might be able to go back to Caracas safely in 2024, which is 3 years away, but I wept with joy that was there. But however, that's very, very slow for the Venezuelans who are dying. So I think we'll see change. And I think Biden, a team, is committed, but also don't forget they're distracted. I mean, you've got Venezuela is not the only priority. However, they are motivated by the fact that doing good things for Venezuela is, of course, a domestic political issue. And as you know, Michael, all politics is local. Florida. I mean, the state of Florida in any presidential election, where you now have hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans and Cubans, is important. So I think that the presence of the diaspora in the United States will ensure that Venezuela does not get dropped from the agenda.
Well, you point out something that's very important. Venezuela is not on the top of the agenda. It's probably very near the bottom of the agenda. This is one of the tragedies, the humanitarian crisis, which is just absolutely extraordinary. I believe that no country in history has suffered as much of a decline, a collapse, so much destruction in so little time, but not in time of war. They did this, the Venezuelans, the Chavistas and the Maduros did this to themselves. And there's so much more attention in the US to Syria. That's a serious situation, but there are more Venezuelan refugees climbing out of that country, swimming out of that country, than Syrian refugees. All you have to do is look at what's going on in Colombia these days. Do you want to comment on something that President Duque has just recently announced? That's a special provisions for Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. There are over 2 million of them now.
Yes, exactly. There are about 2 million Venezuelan refugees and somewhere between 600 or 700,000 Venezuelan children that have come across the border as refugees into Venezuela. On a personal note, I'm adopting out of Colombia, so hopefully Venezuelan refugee children, that's not completed yet, but because the crisis is so huge and it's so shocking. And I went to Cucuta and I think it was January 2018 to see the refugees crossing. Duque has been, Colombia has been a great hermano, has been a great brother country to Venezuela. Don't forget that Venezuela and Colombia were one country. They were Gran Colombia for most of their history together. And then in the battle days of the FARC and the Colombian Civil War, you had, millions of Colombians in Venezuela. The entire service class within Venezuela was very heavily Colombian. And when my mother arrived as an American in Venezuela, she learned to speak Spanish with a heavy Colombian accent because a lot of the people she spent her days talking to were Colombians because such was the exodus. Now that has reversed. Now you hear Venezuelan accents all over Colombia. And we are very, very grateful that Duque has had the compassion to accept that Venezuelans who cross the river will be Venezuelan children born in Colombian terrain will be given Colombian passports and Colombian citizenship, even if they have no papers. If they're born, they will be accepted by Colombia. They are allowing Venezuelans to have access to vaccinations, although they should have generalized access to that's within the larger issue of vaccinations, but the Venezuelans will also have access to them, and to protect them, because part of the cruelty of the Maduro administration, Maduro regime, has been to rob people of their identities, to rob people of their papers, of their ability to renew a passport. The United Kingdom, while I was ambassador here, also granted, because of that, was the first European country, I think second only after the United States, second in the world after the United States, first European country to allow Venezuelans with expired passports to remain legally and work legally, that these are honorable, hardworking people, immigrants in a desperate situation, who want to be part of society, and should be treated as such. And that the Maduro crisis, regime, by forcing them out, starving them, torturing them, and generating an exodus the likes of which the world has never seen in peacetime, and is about to become the biggest exodus ever in history, simply by economic collapse and torture and criminality, is very, very kind of Duque. And for that, we are very grateful to our Colombian brothers, as well as to the United Kingdom.
But we all have to watch what goes on in Colombia, because there may well be a reaction to what the Colombian government is doing for Venezuelans, and has a difficult time these days doing for Colombians. There's an economic disaster there, COVID, the resurgence of certain types of guerrillas. It's multiple tragedies in the same part of the world. Yeah. Let me remind people that if you have questions, just write them in under the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them. Vanessa, you mentioned migration. Can you tell us a little bit about your family, your parents, your grandfather, who are well known to people who know Venezuela? But I think people would like to hear something about all of that.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so Venezuela was to my family, the promised land, right? So my family, my grandfather was Jewish, but ironically, perhaps not ironically, did not think of himself as particularly Jewish, but the family was certainly part of the Jewish community in Prague. And something like, 29 of the family members were wiped out during the Holocaust. And so they arrived, my grandfather and my aunt, Ariana Neumann, who's my grandfather's daughter by his second marriage, so my father's half-sister, just wrote a brilliant book about that, about his experiences in surviving the Holocaust. And at one time ended up living inside a wall, in a wall. Like they, a fake wall with some space, and he spent his days there, and it got out only at night to eat and breathe, and then took on a fake identity and went into hiding, and then had the opportunity to escape and arrived in Venezuela, and he got a people smuggler, just like you see in my book, just like you read about in my book, said they actually applied to the US Embassy, and we have the documentation. The family has the letters to and from the US Embassy in Prague saying, please, can we get out? Can we come to the United States? And they repeatedly said no, 2 or 3 times. Several family members died in the Holocaust as a result. My grandfather then tried to enter the United States, and they said no. And then they ended up actually in Venezuela. So when he arrived in Venezuela, he said, religion had never been a big issue for him personally, but it obviously had marked his life and the experience of the Holocaust. So he arrived in Venezuela and wanted to assimilate. He said, this is my second chance. I've survived, and became a big part of Venezuelan culture and society. Started the Fundación Neumann, the Instituto de Diseño Neumann, which is known as La Neumann, Corimón, and funded all of these cultural foundations, and including the child orchestra that later became El Sistema, that later got co-opted by Chavez. We were one of the original funders. We weren't the only ones. So when the Iron Curtain fell, and Václav Havel came in the Velvet Revolution. I remember we had a dinner party at our home, at my grandfather's home in Los Chorros, and which was known as the house of the perros furibundos, because there were these fierce dogs, and there was a sign on the gate that said perros furibundos. And along came Foreign Minister Dean Spear, who was Václav Havel's foreign minister, and El Gabo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Despite the fact that he was actually quite a bit of a socialist himself, he loved the idea of Václav Havel and the Velvet Revolution and came to dinner at the house. And there the foreign minister said, President Havel has authorized me to please return to you the properties that were seized by the Nazis and then taken by the Soviets. And as a gift of friendship to you, Mr. Neumann, Václav Havel will present your stolen properties in Czechoslovakia back to you. My grandfather sat back in his chair, and I was there at the table, and said, no, thank you, sir. Well, please thank President Havel. I left Czechoslovakia behind. I am a Venezuelan. Venezuela is my country. So we grew up with that concept of duty to Venezuela, that duty was a promised land, that Venezuela was a promised land. We had a duty to protect that. He also founded at the end of his life, after it suffered despite having suffered a devastating stroke, founded the newspaper Tal Cual, which became a big voice and is still around today with Teodoro Pekov as a voice of the opposition, because he wanted to penetrate the popular areas to explain what was happening under Chavez. So the commitment to Venezuela is something that runs in our DNA. And the fight for justice and equality, whether it was escaping the Holocaust or then escaping the Soviets, because by the time my grandfather got out, the Soviets were in charge of Czechoslovakia. So authoritarianism and love of country, the fight against authoritarianism, pro-individual rights, pro-free business, and the love for Venezuela is something that runs very deep in my family. And in me, obviously.
Yes, and so in a sense, the promised land, Venezuela, has become the place from which people flee to go to other promised lands. Once again, what do you think is going to happen? When is there going to be change? How will it change? Is there? You say you want to do it on an individual basis. That's good. We all want that, but some of us have a very difficult time, despite what we want to see happen, actually seeing through to a point where it can be made to happen.
I don't know. Michael, making predictions about Venezuela has been one of my greatest failures as a professional, because I think my heart gets too involved and I always want to see the positive side. And I think, to be honest, even I'm a pretty good analyst in my day job, I would never have imagined that here we would be in 2021 with Maduro still hanging on. So it's the case that keeps proving me and many other people wrong over and over again. There are a number of scenarios. How does it change? It changes in one of, first of all, there could always be a freak accident, right? Maduro is fat. Maybe he has a heart attack, or maybe he has a stroke. Like, these are things that happen, right? And are just that,
and then Tarek El-Assami becomes president?
Well, possibly Tarek El-Assami or something. Yeah, I mean, Iran has said that he would want to be president. The problem is, if something like that happens with Maduro, we are now out of the Chavistas. And, when Chavez died, there was this big, celebration of, oh my God, freedom will ring in Venezuela, and, they're going to become great friends of the United States again, and it's all going to be wonderful. And I said in interview after interview, I said, the rest of them are still there, and hating the US
Yes.
and being allied with the bad guys has worked out quite well for them. So,
that's why
getting rid of Maduro doesn't get rid of the system.
That's right.
You need to have a proper change.
The slogan "Maduro out" is just a bit dangerous, because he's out. Possibly worse are in, and some people say, "Oh, we've achieved our goal. Maduro is out."
The goal is the restoration of democracy, human rights, and freedom, free and fair elections with, something close to free and fair, And no, possibly you could argue that many elections around the world are somewhat flawed, but not like that. Something that's, representative, where political prisoners are freed, where political leaders get their parties back, where human rights are respected, where food and medicine is not politicized, where you don't block food and medicine because you don't like it because it comes from one country and not from another, or you vaccinate only your own generals first.
Yeah.
We know what freedom and democracy look like. That's the goal. Not just getting rid of Maduro, the restoration of freedom and democracy and prosperity and the respect for individual human rights has to be the goal in Venezuela.
Well, I'm reminded of a famous book that was entitled The Last Days of Fidel Castro. And it confidently predicted that with the fall of the Soviet Union, Castro would be replaced, there would be democracy in Cuba. And that book was written in 1993, and it's been a few years since then. Well, you mentioned your day job. I wanted to ask you about your company. It's called Asymmetrica.
Yes.
I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
What does that word mean, and why is it the name of your company? What do you do?
Well, we've changed, like any good company, we've adjusted a bit to market demand, right? So what we do now is a little bit different from what we did, say, 10 years ago. Asymmetrica is the name because it was originally, very simply called Vanessa Neumann, LTD. And I started working with other people and having a bigger team. And a friend of mine said, who was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia, actually, not Latin America, not South, said to me, but you work a lot with asymmetric warfare group. You should call it, you're the asymmetric warfare chick. Call it the Asymmetrica, like Oxford Analytica, just call it Asymmetrica. So I said, it's a really good name. And I'd had some clients, some corporate clients who said, it would be better if you could just change the name. So I said, okay, fine. So I did that. And we continued advising on anti-corruption and that crime terror pipeline and trying to move policy and, for countries to observe better protocols, et cetera, et cetera. What we do today is now we still do some of that work. And we have recently partnered, actually, we've signed an agreement with another firm that operates a lot in Asia to analyze those flows and also and investments. So now we take all of that know-how and relationships and terrain on the ground to advise also investors on what's happening, and that this is the right way to do it, the right partner, the wrong way, and the forecasting. So we will advise people on market entry, on market exit, and on problem solving. But it all comes from the basis of looking at it strategically, and we were very intelligence driven.
Very good. Here's a question. This is from an old friend, Martin Schubert. This is a fantastic interview. Both of you were great. Thank you. My question, will Saab ever be shipped to the US? And what do you think he will say, having been out a while?
Okay, so that's a great question. So I think Saab will eventually be shipped to the US. I think he will be extradited to the US. And I don't know if you read the Financial Times article recently about that there was a manipulation of social media in Africa and internationally to make it seem like people don't want Saab to be extradited when they do. I think he will be extradited to the United States. I think that he will provide a lot of insight into the relationships and the fixers and the facilitators and how the money flowed, how the illicit trade worked, et cetera, and really mapping out that network, as I said, of Iranians and Russians and Mexican cartels and Colombian terrorist groups and the Chavistas and where are the homes and how they think about things. That's great. That's the kind of thing that really makes me very excited. It's the kind of thing I care about. Here's the problem with that. Every day, the minute Saab got arrested, that money moved. That the bank accounts got closed and the money moved and the assets got sold. So his value in giving intelligence on the who, the what, the where, and the how, while it will give you strategic insight, you're not going to find the money where he left it.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question from another old friend, Milos Alcalai. I'm sure you remember him, a former ambassador.
I do.
Una conversación extraordinaria de ambos. Felicitaciones. Sin embargo, hay un punto que quedó fuera. No es solamente el drama venezolano que es el más grave, pero la estrategia destructiva en contra de las débiles democracias latinoamericanas y la estrategia destructiva de Cuba. Maduro y los viudos del Foro de Sao Paulo para desestabilizar las difíciles experiencias de democratización. A statement rather than a question, but the question is, do you agree?
Yeah, the question is, I do agree. I do agree. So there is an inherent weakness within Latin American political systems. And I'm afraid to say, much as I love the region, and my fellow compatriots, there's almost a genetic weakness that it's the caudillismo, right? So there's very much a cult of personality that overrides a respect for institutions. And I wrote about this in my dissertation. I mean, I published it in 2004, that the capacity that the Venezuelans saying, oh, we'll give you a ley habilitante. Don't worry about it, Chavez. Rewrite the constitution. You can rule by decree as long as you like, and then we'll be right here. I said, wait a minute. You're giving away your power as a citizen. You're giving away your power for representative government. And I think that that's very typically Latin American. They very much seek the strong man, and they view the Congress as weak or the governors as weak, and they don't empower them. And so what that leads to is it's a recipe for corruption. It's a recipe for cronyism. That it's the guy in charge, and it leads to another thing that we're seeing in Venezuela, the former president that doesn't go away. Then he just appoints a puppet, like a little bit like Putin and Medvedev. Then the next guy who runs for the party, the previous president, is still behind the scenes. They never really exit stage left. This has been a particularly Latin American problem, and that's something that opens the field for people who know how to destabilize, like the Cubans and like the Russians and also like the Iranians. You can take that weakness there and you can destabilize and reduce the faith of people, of individuals in their governments. And then you just get into a back and forth of coup and counter coup, and human rights being abused all over the map. Unfortunately, you're also seeing this in other countries. So while this has been a particularly Latin American feature, you're also seeing it in first world countries now, like Europe and the North.
Not a happy situation. Well, I think we're running out of time. I'm going to ask Carlos Ivan to take over again. Carlos.
Amazing discussion, Vanessa and Michael. Very interesting topics and insights on the situation of Venezuela, and no one better prepared to talk to them about them than you. I'm sure everyone enjoyed this today. In fact, so apologies for the advertisement. I just bought your book to read it. It's I'm sure it's amazing. I'm going to enjoy it as much as this discussion today. Thanks both for presenting this event today for VAUS. Thanks a lot also to our hardworking association team for making this event possible, Lina Delgado, Linda Calvet, and Lori Dominguez. And just a quick reminder, tomorrow at 10 a.m. we have a joint program with the Colombian American Association and the Wilson Center on temporary protected legal status for the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia and the situation of refugees. We have an outstanding panel, including the Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs of Colombia, the advisor to the President of Colombia on the Colombia-Venezuelan border, a representative on the UN High Commission for Refugees, and the Norwegian Refugee Council. It's not too late to sign up. If you don't have an invitation, please let our team know and we'll send it to you. If you're not already a member of VAUS and are interested in joining, please contact our team via the invitation. Thank you all for participating, and we look forward to meeting you again tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Always.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, VAUS.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.